Put that coffee down.
I'm not here to waste your time, okay? I certainly hope you're not here to waste mine. So I'm gonna keep this short.
Helen, we're both in sales. Let me tell you why I suck as a salesman.
The most valuable commodity I know of is information. Wouldn't you agree?
Coffee's for closers only.
Welcome back to the Behind Your Back podcast with me, Bradley Hartman. This podcast, we talk about leadership, personal productivity, time management, and the craft of selling in the construction industry. This episode is brought to you by the engineered wood products of Boise Cascade. They help you move faster and build stronger. They make it easier to get more done. And our friends at Materials Exchange is the LBM Industries answer to E-Trade. Materials Exchange is your digital marketplace for lumber and panels. So given all the craziness in our industry right now that may or may not include for you the pandemic, the labor shortage, sky-high building material prices, the pending infrastructure bill, there's just a lot of things that are going on right now. And I thought it was the perfect time to bring in my mentor, my friend, Rich Horwath, to help us think more strategically. Now, Rich was my professor in my MBA program going on, 13 or 14 years ago, and I was lucky to meet him, learned a ton from him, and we've stayed in touch, and he's been an extremely valuable mentor to me over the years. He is the CEO of the Strategic Thinking Institute, and Rich has helped more than 100,000 managers develop their strategic thinking skills through live workshops and virtual learning programs. Rich is a coach to senior executives on a one-to-one basis, and he helps them develop high-level strategic capabilities through a longer-term customized approach. If you can be on TV, Rich has been there. He's been on ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox TV, and his work has been featured in publications like Fast Company, Forbes, the Harvard Business Review, that's swanky, and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. He's the author of 7 books, including Deep Dive, Strategy for You, Building a Bridge to the Life You Want, Elevate, the 3 Disciplines of Advanced Strategic Thinking, and his most recent book, Strategy Man, which I purchased over 100 copies of and gladly distributed to friends and clients and overwhelmingly heard fantastic feedback. He's also created more than 200 resources available, and he has created over 200 strategic thinking resources available. Many of them are available for free on his website. So yeah, he is the strategic thinking leader in the space. And in this conversation, we talk about goal setting in a time when goals are set and obliterated so quickly, whether that was the pandemic, whether it was sky-high lumber and building material pricing. We talk about how to set goals during very volatile, uncertain times. We talk about leveraging the virtual environment for strategic thinking. We talk about scenario planning to make sure that we are not consistently surprised at what comes out. As leaders, it's our responsibility to think through the different scenarios that might come about. And we talk about 90-day plans. If it's crazy to think about what might happen in the next 12 months or 6 months, there's absolutely no reason we can't put together, whether you're a CEO or you're an individual contributor, there's no reason that you can't put together for yourself a 90-day plan. And he walks us through that. It's called the Leader Propulsion Plan. So I think this is just incredibly timely, incredibly valuable, and I'm thrilled to bring to you my conversation with Mr. Rich Horwath, CEO of the Strategic Thinking Institute. So Mr. Rich Horwath, welcome to the show.
Bradley, great to be with you again. Always good to chat with you.
Likewise. Well, you know, we've talked about kind of the context that we're living in right now in the construction industry, supply chain disruption, coming off of COVID. We have a labor shortage. It used to be a joke that we would have $100 plywood. Now it's not really a joke. It's kind of what we're dealing with here. The thing that had me immediately thinking of you, Rich, was we're talking to some clients. I've had a couple of them say very similar things along the lines of, well, once COVID hit in March of 2020, and then once the pricing has just gone through the absolute roof at the beginning of this year, things are moving so fast, we don't really even have time to set goals or adjust our strategy. We're just trying to hang on for dear life. And I think like them, on one hand, I'm like, well, that's crazy. We can't do that. On the other hand, I'm kind of living in it too. And I'm like, I know exactly what that's like from a kind of a third party perspective, and being you're at least you're my guru for strategy here. What advice might you have for folks that are living in these really volatile, kind of uncertain times right now?
Well, Bradley, first thing I would say is bouncing from one thing to the next with no rhyme or reason is like being a bumper car at the carnival. So the first thing I'd say is don't be a carny. Okay. Be strategic. It's easy to fall into the trap of, I don't know what's happening next. There's all this uncertainty. There's complexity. That's fine. But the really great leaders that I'm working with today understand that that's going to be par for the course moving forward. So we can either spend some of the mental bandwidth we have, worrying about that stuff, or we can drill down to what I think are really the two most important questions for any manager, any leader, any individual contributor out there. And that is, what are we trying to achieve and how are we going to do it? Because at the essence of any plan, at the core foundation of any plan, those are the two questions. What are we trying to achieve and how are we going to do it? So all the other stuff swirling around, we need to keep an eye on. But at the end of the day, those are the two questions that we need to focus on. And back to your point, as far as goals go, goals and objectives answer that first question. What are we trying to achieve? The goal is generally what you're trying to achieve. The objective is more specific. We quantify it, put a number and a time frame on it. So if you as a leader or a manager, or individual contributor, if you don't know what you're trying to achieve, then I got to ask, what are you doing? Mm-hmm. So step back, sit down with your team and answer those two questions. What are we trying to achieve? How are we going to do it?
Well, I love that, because I think folks who are listening, if they're executive leaders, they might be nodding their head saying, absolutely, we can schedule this meeting for next week, or I can shut my phone off for 30 minutes and start that. But I also think that's simplistic enough. What are we trying to achieve? How are we doing it? That an individual contributor, someone on the front lines, can say, all right, well, if this is unclear to me, I'm going to try to just answer this for myself and just go ahead and jot this down as I think about what I'm doing with my time and where, the goals that I'm working towards.
And Bradley, you just hit on such a great point there. You've got to first answer those questions for yourself. I see too many managers, too many people out there saying, well, I'm waiting for the company. I'm waiting for my leadership to give me the strategy, to give me. No, why would you do that? Take ownership. I don't care what position you're in the company. Take ownership. Like you just said, you've got to answer those two questions for yourself. Every morning when you get up, what do I try to achieve today? How am I going to do it? What does that look like for my week, for my month, for my quarter? And so again, I think that point you brought up, answer those questions for yourself first. Take some ownership. That's a key mindset.
Yeah. Have you seen any leaders? Obviously, you've been consulting and helping folks navigate through something very similar, or maybe even, more stressful than what we're living now in the construction industry. I think the obvious solution is shut the phone off, create the space, sit alone with yourself and think about that. Do you have any other, best practices or piece of advice when we have this realization, I am in the middle of a raging river, I don't even know what to do? Well, the first thing is to get out of that to what you can, but are there maybe any things that you would suggest that said, I know where you're at now, and you're going to think, I don't even have time to do that. But if we don't have time for strategy and we don't have time for leadership, some other questions bubble to the surface.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like you said, first and foremost, you got to carve the time out to be able to step back and think about the business. I think what that allows you to do then is, John Boyd was a great fighter pilot in the U.S. Air Force, and a lot of the folks out there probably are familiar with him, but he had an interesting framework when he would fly. It was called the OODA loop, mm-hmm. And it was basically observe, orient, decide, and act. And then look, talk about chaos, right? I mean, if you're a fighter pilot in World War II, it doesn't get more frenetic or chaotic than that. So, we got to keep in perspective the times that we're living through. But that model of OODA, observe, orient, decide, act, I think is something that all of us can use, again, no matter what your position. So let's first observe what's happening. And again, it's one thing to observe what's happening. Sit down with your team and get a flip chart, get a whiteboard, and start jotting down. And what I like to do is I actually have a visual I use called the contextual radar. It's very simple. It's a circle with a line from the top to the bottom and from the left to the right. So it's 4 quadrants of that circle.
Okay.
In one quadrant is market, one quadrant's customers, another quadrant is competitors, and then the other quadrant is company. So market, customer, competitor, company. So let's observe first what's happening in each of those areas. So actually take the stuff that's flying around in your head and put it down on paper, put it on the flip chart, talk about it with your team. Then let's orient. What do these things mean? A lot of what's on there is not going to be relevant to what you're doing day in and day out. Mm-hmm. So cross that stuff off, then start circling the stuff that really is important to what you're trying to do, to what you're trying to achieve. Then make some decisions. And again, we've got to remember in business that the word decision comes from the Latin word decidere, which means to cut off. So when we say make decisions, what we're really saying is let's cut some stuff off from our time and attention so that we can focus on what's most important. So again, I think, if leaders adopt that OODA loop and you use that radar to jot down all the stuff that's in your mind, now again, it doesn't eliminate the chaos, but it helps us focus on what's important and eliminate the noise around us.
I think that's really powerful because I know personally is when I'm feeling stressed about something, it seems there's no avenue for it to get out and get on paper. And once I just kind of dump it out to a certain degree, that solves part of it and said, okay, at least I can look at this. But I can also imagine, theoretically, this would work on a whiteboard or a flip chart, a big circle, put it into quadrants for market, customer, competitor, and company, and just really just go literally just jot out there on the paper or with a sticky pad, just some of the observations you're seeing?
Yeah, exactly. And like you said, when we have fear and uncertainty, it's because things are unknown or we haven't thought them through yet.
Right.
That's why we fear them. That's why we worry about them. But the first step, like you said, is to observe that, put it down on paper, talk about it with your team. That tremendously, as I've been leading strategic planning sessions the last year, mostly virtually, that eliminates a lot of the anxiety in the room already. It takes it from a 10 down to a 3 or 4, and then people can start to have some productive conversations. So I think, again, those are some good first steps. And then, at the end of the day, again, I'll always come back to, what actually is going to move the needle here. There's a lot of activity we could do. But if you think about all of the options we have, let's rank them on a scale of 1 to 10 on impact. Because don't go, a lot of people get caught up in the trap of activity for activity's sake, but especially these days, when there is a lot of uncertainty and volatility around us, we've got to make sure our people and our teams are focused on what's most important. So I would really consider, jotting down the projects, activities, tasks, tactics that you and your team are working on and rate them on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being low impact, 10 being high impact. That's also when I do strategic coaching with senior leaders, that's an exercise I have them do for the meetings that they're attending.
Okay.
Rate your meetings on a scale of 1 to 10. What's the impact there? Because again, typically the research says we spend about 40% of our time in meetings. So if you've got meetings that are 60 minutes and should be 30 minutes or 30 minutes and shouldn't be a meeting at all, then start to, again, make decisions and cut those things off.
Yeah, and I think this was something I read from you along the way, but I'll often think through myself and then work with clients is thinking about the impact and then just kind of have a little simple 2x2 grid where you also have the effort required. And you can say, normally there's a sweet spot, which is high impact, relatively low effort. And you can say, okay, well, this is, kind of your quick win, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. So to your point, you can definitely measure, what's the lift it's going to take to get this done.
Yeah.
And like you said, it's more art than science, especially when you use that 2x2, which I think is a great framework. Just because something may be higher on the lift doesn't mean we cross it off the list. We just have to understand, is the impact really worth it? And again, to your point, when we think about the lift or the effort, we also want to think about that probability of achievement. So, if we do push this lift, does our team have the skills, the knowledge, the tools, the resources to be successful? If the answer is no, then even if the impact is high, that's probably something you're going to want to table and save for another time.
Yeah, no, that's really well said. Let me ask you about scenario planning. I've been trying to be better just leading conversations with other executive leaders, because if rewind 12 months, if you said, hey, let's think 12 months from now, let's imagine what, the price of lumber or engineered wood, or you pick a commodity really in the building material business and said, imagine if it is at this price. I had an executive leader tell me the other day, he said, if you told me where lumber would be in terms of board foot 12 months ago, he said, I would have bet you $10,000 cash. It never would have been there. And yet he says, I struggle to foresee a future where it could go up even another 10%. And he's like, but that doesn't make sense. Of course it can. I never thought it would be here. So as we think about future scenarios, worst case, best case, most likely, how do you help your clients and your executive leaders, or anyone really, think through intelligently what those might be?
So I'm going to share with your listeners, Bradley, a secret about you that many of them probably don't know, that Bradley was a Division I quarterback for football. So if you get a chance to chat with him, ask him about his playing career and some of his brushes with greatness, which are fascinating. But again, let's use the football analogy. So, if you're a head coach, you're running the ball first half, that's your game plan. And then you get into halftime, you're down 28-0. Unless you're one of the former Chicago Bears coaches, that's not really typically, something that you would do in the second half. You wouldn't just keep running the ball. You're going to make adjustments. You're going to potentially throw the ball more, try some different formations. So again, a football coach doesn't go into a game, not having any idea what's going to happen at halftime if the plays they're running don't work.
Right.
They've got a lot of things scripted out. They've got contingencies and scenarios that they've envisioned. So the reality is, and to be frank, if we're a leader or a manager and we haven't thought through the scenarios, the options that are possible, then the reality is we're no better prepared for success than a peewee football coach. Because I know a lot of peewee football coaches coaching 10-year-olds that are watching 20 hours of film a week and they're scripting 55 different options. Mm-hmm. So there's no excuse for managers today, especially after the last year we've been through, that don't have at least 3 to 5 scenarios plotted out for the future. And again, when I lead these types of conversations, what we'll do is typically think about what would be the spectrum of options for what our business could look like in the future. So both on the positive end and then on the negative end. Then we want to think about, okay, for those 3 to 5 scenarios, what would be some of the driving causal factors? So what would need to happen for those things to happen? Then we want to think about, okay, if they did happen, if this scenario played out, what would be the consequences for us? Again, either positive or negative or neutral. So what would those consequences look like? And then what would be that impact? Again, I like to use a simple scale, 1 to 5, 1 low impact, 5 high impact. And then what I typically recommend is once you've laid those 5 scenarios out, then, we've talked about this before, that GHOST framework. What are your goals, objectives, strategies, tactics for each scenario?
Okay.
Typically people, good leaders will have a GHOST framework for their business in the scenario that they're living today. The great leaders take the extra time to create that GHOST framework for those 3 to 5 scenarios. Because then if you do that and you run into what you're running into now in this industry and some of the pricing changes, now at least you've got some idea of where should we start. Mm-hmm. But if you're just starting from square one, you're probably going to be behind at least 1 or 2 competitors that have given it some thought.
Yeah, you mentioned something there that I found to be really powerful. Is you said something along the lines of, what would have to be true or what would have to happen for this to result.
Yeah.
And I've just found just that sentence alone, it kind of does that thing where you have to think about the imagined future. And sometimes it's fairly obvious what would have to happen here, even if we think those are unlikely, to allow us to get there.
Yeah, exactly. And the question that you just framed, I think is a great one, especially too, as you think about the competition, the move to digital in a lot of industries. and in your industry. Again, one of the things I think is interesting too is domain jumping. So, jump to a different domain as you think about these scenarios. So, what if an Amazon-like player emerged in our industry? Or what if a Disney-like player emerged in our industry that had, ridiculously great customer service? What would that mean to us? So again, I like that idea of domain jumping too, in addition to because I think it builds on the question that you just framed, and then start thinking about competitors and about other, major shifts in the landscape. So again, while people might not have been able to predict exactly a pandemic due to a virus, you could certainly predict, you certainly a scenario could have been, what if the price of plywood goes up to $100 a sheet? I mean, that's something that people could predict. You say, well, maybe we can't predict the virus, but in what caused that, but you can certainly predict those outcomes.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. So Rich, you referred to doing virtual sessions with your clients for strategy sessions or strategic thinking. Curious, for teams that have been accustomed to doing this in person and have had to change that, what have you learned of doing more of these virtually, and maybe kind of the pros and cons that come with it?
Yeah, I would say the biggest learning has been to make sure when you're meeting virtually that it's a completely immersive, interactive, collective engagement. And what I mean by that is, when we were back doing live sessions, too often, there'd be kind of that talking head where it'd be more of a presentation and less interaction, less dialogue. Right. And so what I found is, especially virtually, you cannot listen to somebody for 15, 20 minutes just, on a monologue basis. I mean, that kills the session. So what I found is it's really important to give people 2 or 3 really salient questions before you get together, and then maybe an interesting article or a book chapter, and then have them prepared to talk about the content of that article or book chapter, and then have them ready to respond to those questions so that when you get into the live session, it's really a collective dialogue, and it's not, Rich or Bradley or somebody else talking for 20 or 25 minutes and then, okay, go ahead, go break out and do this exercise. To me, the interaction has to be from the get-go in any session.
Yeah, it sounds like if you were to do that, you're building momentum that just continues and escalates when we're together, as opposed to, realizing that people are just slamming their phone down and looking in the screen like, okay, I'm here. What are we doing? Right. And then you're really starting from scratch, as opposed to just a continuation of, being thoughtful.
Yeah, exactly. So that I'd say probably is the biggest thing. And then the other part too of doing things virtually is really giving people the time at the end of the session to really come back to reflect on, what did we take away here? And specifically, how am I going to apply this to my work tomorrow? Mm-hmm. If you don't walk out of meetings, virtual meetings, with the learnings and the application, then we wasted that time.
I can tell you one of the things that once I started doing it, immediately saw the improvement was, whether it's a 1-hour workshop or it's a full day event, leaving enough time to go around the room and say, hey, what are the insights that you've got and how are you going to apply them? Because often they're like, hey, we can actually give an hour of Rich's time back. And I know he's busy. We've been here for 2 days. I'm sure he's got 100 emails and 50 voicemails. And I've learned you got to resist that urge, because often something that 2 or 3 other people said that might have been executive leaders is different when another frontline employee says, this blew my mind and this is a huge opportunity. And I've already started doing it yesterday. I called my team.
Yep.
That is often the most impactful. And sometimes we're at the 1 yard line. Let's just get the hell out of here. Slowing it down and doing that, I've personally found is so powerful.
Yep. I completely agree.
Your newsletter post recently, I read probably 3 times, and then I passed out to many of my clients because we've had this conversation similar to where we started, which is, man, goals for the year, I'm just trying to get through the day. And then I would say, well, is there any way we can maybe think about how we get through the next 30 days? And you're like, maybe. Yeah. And you talked about kind of I'll make sure I don't butcher this, but it's a leader propulsion 90-day plan. And I think in our industry now, there's plenty of uncertainty, but we should be at minimum thinking about the next quarter and 90 days in front of us. So A, let me know, did I butcher that? And number two, do you mind walking us through that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So you were spot on. So the leader propulsion plan, and I use that word propulsion intentionally because I think now, especially when people are working out of home offices and are not interacting as much physically, there's a level of inertia that develops. So I think propulsion is something that we need to keep in mind because, like the shark, if we're not constantly moving forward and progressing, things tend to stagnate, tend to die. So the leader propulsion plan initially was something I would work with executives who were new to role or folks that were individual contributors now in a management role initially because they hadn't had a lot of experience planning. So you want to get a fast start in a new job or in a new leadership role. So we created this template and process to help people think about, if I'm a leader, what are all those checkpoints that I need to go through in the first 90 days so that I am really on top of it, so that I'm not just treading water. I'm out there leading the pack, even ahead of folks that have been leading in this group for a while now. And so, as I think about that leader propulsion plan, I like to think about kind of in 3 chunks or 3 pages. So page 1 is really, something that you mentioned early in our conversation today. Page 1 is really about the insights, the learnings, and performance. So if I think about what I'm, as a leader, and I'm looking at the next 90 days, and I define an insight as a learning that leads to new value. So what are the learnings that I've picked up in my conversations, my meetings, that are going to help me create new value? And typically you can categorize the learnings or insights around marketplace, competition, customers, relationships, whatever it might be. And then performance. How am I tracking my performance and my team's performance? Again, it's great to have a dashboard, but if the dashboard has 55 things on it, it's not going to be relatable. So want to think about what are those 2 to 3 metrics that are really going to determine how we're performing. So that's page 1 or section 1. Page 2, then I really think about people and priorities. So when I think about people, I think about, if I'm a leader, how am I leading my direct reports? What's happening with them? How are they updating me on the business? Is it consistent? I hear so often from leaders that their direct reports aren't giving them consistent, universal updates. And I think, well, that's crazy. You've got to be able to get good updates in order for you to make good decisions at your level. Then we also think about other people like their boss. So if you're not the CEO, who do you report to and how are you managing up? And what does that relationship look like? What's that cadence of communication? And then what are your priorities? What are those 3 to 5 things that really are driving your next 90 days? And then the third page is simply that action plan. So again, what are you trying to achieve? How are you going to do it within that next 90 days?
Okay. Well, and I can see too, is kind of tying right back to the 2 questions anyone listening can answer. What are you trying to do? And how are you doing it? And answering that for yourself. And recently I've had a couple poignant conversations with folks who basically said, what you're describing and the things that you're talking about, I firmly believe in and want to do, but these behaviors and these discussions they're not happening above me. What can I do? And I'd say, well, listen, if you can answer those questions for yourself, what are you trying to do? How are you going to do it? And then understand your contribution and put that on paper and give it to your boss. I mean, I guess there's a boss out there who would say, I don't know what this is. I don't want it. I don't know who they are and I don't want to be associated with them. So, if nothing else, this clarity is really going to help where your own effort is going and is going to help you achieve something.
Yeah. And that's a great point that you bring up, Bradley. It's very fair to use those 2 questions, not just for yourself, as you mentioned, but pose those to your boss. Right. Pose those to your peers. Pose those to your customers. We talk about being a strategic partner to our customers, but a lot of times that's lip service. But if you really know what they're trying to achieve, what their goals are, what their objectives are, what their performance metrics are, and then you know what their strategies are, how they're trying to do it, now you can start to say, all right, I see the bigger picture here for them as a customer. Where can I find new ways to create value within that big picture for them? So I like your idea there of not only using those 2 questions for yourself, but start posing those to your leadership, to your peers, to your customers.
Yeah. Well, we often kind of hear this phrase, but we want to be a consultative seller or we want to be a consultative vendor. And I was like, well, don't overthink it. What would a consultant say? And I was like, honestly, I do this. I'm like, hey, we want to work together? All right. What are you trying to do? How are you doing it? How might I help? Let's talk about that. But as you know, even for very sophisticated, successful businesses, sometimes that clarity is not there.
Right. And again, we want to try to take the complex and make it simplify it. And so, and we've talked about this before, the framework that I use to make strategy as simple as possible, to think strategically, is just those 3 A's, acumen, what's the learning here, the new value, allocation, where do I need to put my resources today, tomorrow, this quarter to be successful, and then action, what are the priorities that I want to execute? So acumen, what's the new value I can bring? Allocation, where should I focus my resources? And then action, what are my priorities? That's a good way for anybody out there to think about and simplify, what they're doing.
Yeah, and a big key that I've learned from you is also that when you think about that allocation, about what are we not doing and what's on the not to-do list and how to be really intentional there, because it's real easy just to add and add and add. And you mentioned that before about, the etymology of to decide, or if I'm butchering that, was about pruning. What do we stop doing? And if we weren't doing this today already, would we continue doing it in the future? Sometimes that gets harder because you got sunk cost fallacy and you got existing projects and you got the pet project of the CEO who's not even there anymore, like all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. And for everybody out there, Bradley brings up a great point. One of the things that's interesting to do, especially these days, is, do that blank page exercise. So if you were walking into your job tomorrow for the first time ever, and you said, okay, here are the things that, we need to get done. How would you get them done? Would you do everything that you're doing currently? Right. Or would you say, well, this doesn't make any sense. And, this is kind of a waste of time, or we don't need to spend 10 hours on this. We could be spending 5. So take that blank page approach. I recommend kind of quarterly stepping back and again, thinking about what should we stop doing? What should we do less of? What should we do more of? What should we start doing?
Well, I think this is a great place to kind of wrap it up, but not too soon, because I think your newsletters, obviously got all your books, really helped me just to do that, to take a step back. And actually you gave me, I don't know if you still sell these, but I'm staring at it right now with the audio medium. It's not very helpful, but you gave me kind of a one kind of strategic thought per day on a really nice kind of walnut piece of wood that you flip over day by day throughout the year. You have so many resources that are out there, and I think these are so important now. I can tell you your Strategy Man book that came out, which really kind of takes a lot of the best from the Marvel universe and then adapts it to strategic thinking. We bought, I think we bought over 100 of those books for our workshop we did pre-pandemic and got great feedback. But for folks that are listening and say, all right, what are my options here? Obviously, I would recommend Strategy Man and your books. You got your newsletter, you got some online learning. You kind of have the gambit from free to paid. Maybe give kind of a next step for people that know we're in the middle of kind of a crazy time and we need to be more strategic.
Yeah. So, I'm a big believer in, trying to the vision for my company is teach the world to be strategic. So I'm a big believer in trying to help everybody out there be more strategic, because I think if people are strategic, that means you've got insight that helps all of us advance or progress to where we want to be. And if we all progress, to me, it's not a zero-sum game. We can all help each other get better. And I think, that's what we're trying to do. So to your point, on our website, strategyskills.com, we've got a lot of different free articles, white papers. There's a lot of free videos on there. I have a YouTube channel that you can go to that's got a lot of free videos as well. I mean, there's probably 100 or so out there now too. So, I'm a big believer that, start there, start with all of the articles, the white papers, the infographics, the podcasts, all of those good things. And then to your point, there's micro learnings where you can get something once a week that's 3 to 5 minutes to learn a little bit more, called Strategy Espresso. There's that free newsletter you mentioned, Strategic Thinker, you can sign up for. So yeah, and then there's the books. And then obviously, for those folks that, want more deeper level assistance, there's always the strategic coaching or the workshops if you and your team want some guidance on those types of things. But again, I think for everybody out there, the reminder is, if you want new sustainable growth, you've got to have new ways to think about your business. And I think, if nothing else, the last year has taught us we can't just do what we've always done before. We've got to think in new ways.
Yeah, it's really well said. Well, it's I think a great place to end. Rich, I know you're busy, and I appreciate you making time to share your thoughts. And I thought strategic thinking is obviously always important, but right now, when I feel like all of us are kind of in the eye of the hurricane to some degree, being able to kind of step back and getting your thoughts on this would be a good reminder to everybody. So thank you.
Thanks, Bradley. Always great to be with you.
As always, I hope that conversation with Rich was worth your time and attention. Hopefully you can apply some of these principles immediately to help you and your team think more strategically. If you have any suggestions for future shows or feedback to this episode or ideas for potential guests or maybe issues that you are personally dealing with, do not hesitate to email me directly at bradley@behindyourbacksales.com. Again, bradley@behindyourbacksales.com. You can link up with me on LinkedIn or connect with me on Instagram at behindyourbackceo. If you did find this episode valuable, please share it with your network and leave a review. Those mean more to us than you know. I want to thank our sponsors. You can learn more about Boise Cascade's engineered wood products and their innovative Sawtech technology by visiting bc.com/EWP. And our friends at Materials Exchange. What E-Trade is for the stock market, Materials Exchange is to the LBM industry. They make commodity pricing transparent, buying simple, and the fees are low. So as always, thank you for your time and attention. I hope you got value from this. You, my friend, are owed nothing. Deliver value first.